Well, welcome in everyone. Hi, I'm Jenna Roll, Director of Education at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and Sea Center. Welcome to Science Pub from Home. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing entomologist, author, lecturer, photographer, radio host, and America's unofficial busiest man alive, Dr. Art Evans. Art is joining us from Richmond, Virginia this evening. He has an impressive biography and resume. Art, I'm going to turn it over to you to fill us in on the details of your fascinating life and areas of expertise. So please take it away.
All right, thanks, Jenna. That was a wonderful introduction. Let me get this screen going here. Here we go. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you my inordinate fondness for beetles, if you will. A little bit about my background. I'm a trustee and research associate here at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. I'm also a research associate at the California State Collection of Arthropods. As you'll find out, I'm originally from California. And I should also mention too, this lovely person sitting next to me is my wife, Paula. So please don't think I'm just ignoring her, but she's joining me tonight. I'm also a research collaborator at the in the entomology department at the Smithsonian, and I teach at several universities here in the Richmond area, Randolph-Macon College, University of Richmond, and Virginia Commonwealth University, where I teach entomology, medical and veterinary entomology, and a course for non-science majors called Insects and Humans. As Jenna mentioned, I'm also, pardon me, a radio broadcaster. I had a segment for 10 years on Richmond Public Radio called What's Bugging You that aired during NPR's Morning Edition. And every week we would have a new story about insects or talking about something of entomological interest. And whenever I get an opportunity, I try and get a little bit of research in, but I also do a lot of writing as well. Books about insects and arthropods, and of course my very favorite insects, the beetles. And that's what brings us here this evening to talk about my latest book, Beetles of Western North America, published by Princeton University Press. This is a compact guide that covers 1,428 species found in all 131 families known to occur west of the Continental Divide. It includes over 1,500 images. There's an illustrated key to families and so on. And I'd like to take a few moments to share with you some of the features of this book. But before I go too far, I want to say that I am indebted to all these photographers who helped me. As I said, the book contains about 1,500 images. Half of them are mine, and the other half were made by these 116 photographers. And it was because of their diligence and generosity the book has the look and feel and taxonomic breadth that it does. Without them, I could never have published this book. And I want to thank each and every one of them for their hard work and again, for sharing their wonderful images with me. I also want to give a shout out to my good friend, Jen Reed in Ontario. I've known Jen for years. She used to work at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and she helped me with many of the images in the book, especially those as they relate to morphology. She's excellent at labeling images and doing the photoshopping that was necessary to create some of the graphs. And she also did the original illustrations that appear in the book, especially in the family key. This book covers beetles west of the Continental Divide. That's all the way from Alaska all the way down to Western Mexico. But in reality, most of the beetles that I'm focusing on are those that are found from southern British Columbia down to Southern California and Southeast Arizona. There's an extensive introduction to beetles of Western North America covering their morphology. There's a nice spread that gives an example of the diversity of beetle larvae. Beetle larvae do not get their due. They can be a real challenge. Many of the beetles that we know commonly, we have no idea what their larvae look like. And it would be wonderful to have a detailed book about them someday. I don't know any publishers that would touch a book dedicated to larvae. But still, it would be a worthwhile project. But I was fortunate enough that the book lined up in such a way that you can just open to this spread and get an idea of the diversity of the immature stages of these wonderful insects. There's also information on their behavior and natural history, parental care, and more. Also, I had the opportunity to highlight a couple of things about beetles that are pertinent to Western North America. And one of them involves research done by my friend Anna Holden and her colleagues. She was working with a cache of arthropod fragments found in a 40,000-year-old camel skull at La Brea tar pits. And it turns out that the fragments of arthropods were also dated at about 40,000 years old. And this is of interest because it gives us a very clear picture as to the environment of the Los Angeles basin 40,000 years ago. Up to this time, we've felt that researchers believe that the Los Angeles basin around that time was wetter and cooler based on primarily plant fragments. But looking at this cache of insect and other arthropod remains, many of which in the area, it's clear that the Los Angeles basin was warmer and drier back then than we had thought previously. One of the interesting discoveries was this head and prothorax of the black-legged ham beetle, Necrobia violacea. Here's a photograph of a living one. This was preserved inside that camel skull. For years, it was thought that this beetle was brought over by the European colonists and introduced into North America. But the fact that these remains, 40,000-year-old remains, were found indicates that this beetle was already in the New World before the Europeans arrived. And this is an indication that possibly the beetles were originated here in North America and then were inadvertently transported back to Europe. Or there's a possibility that they are widely distributed in the Northern Hemisphere. We don't know that particular story yet, which of those cases will be borne out. But anyway, this was a very interesting paper and about some really fascinating research. And I had the opportunity to share it in the introduction of this book. I'm a big believer in collecting beetles. Unlike many other insects, such as butterflies, some of the larger moths, dragonflies, and damselflies, many of which can be identified on site, beetles are a challenge to identify. And so in order to get accurate identifications, you have to have those beetles in hand. Often we have to look at them internally. We're dissecting their reproductive organs to make an accurate identification. So there's extensive information on collecting beetles and how to prepare museum quality specimens. Here are some of my friends in the field demonstrating different types of collecting techniques. On the left is Dave Carlson, and he is fluming. He's got these pool nets set in a flume. Some of you might be familiar with the flumes that crisscross the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada in California. And there's a lot of plant material and insects that are constantly washing down these flumes, and you capture them in these nets and then spread the material out on a white sheet and sort out the insects. And there are really some amazing species that are found by this method. I had never done this before, and Dave took me to the spot, and we spent a wonderful afternoon just east of Sacramento. Next to Dave is, I think you'll see a familiar face. That's Matt Gimmel with the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Matt was a great help to me with this book, and I'll talk about him toward the end of this presentation. But Matt's demonstrating the use of a shallow white pan, which can be used for multiple purposes. Here he is using it as a beating tray, putting it underneath flowers, beating on the flowers gently with a stick, and whatever beetles and other insects are found on those plants, they'll fall into the light-colored surface where they could be sucked up with an aspirator. That's what he's holding in his mouth. It can also be used to grab handfuls of moss, rotten wood, or leaf litter and just dump them into the pan and then carefully sort through the material. I had never seen anybody use this technique before until Matt took me out in the field once, and I've been using it ever since. Next to Matt is another good friend, Bob Anderson at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and he's demonstrating using a Winkler separator with a leaf litter. You put handfuls of leaf litter in this funnel and you shake it, and the finer material along with beetles and other arthropods wind up in a big ball down in the bottom of this bag, and that material is carefully transferred to a cloth funnel, if you will, and allowed to air dry. And as the soil, the particles of leaf litter and so on begin to dry, beetles and other arthropods will escape and fall into a container filled with preservative. And sometimes this is the only way you're going to find some really unusual species. Bob's demonstrating this technique in Arizona at the Southwest Research Station. And on the far right is my friend Chris Worth. He's at Purdue University right now, and he's looking for beetles at a black light. This is an ultraviolet light that's put in front of a sheet to attract insects. Beetles are particularly, nocturnal beetles are particularly attracted to these lights. And this is a setup that's commercially available through BioQuip, and it's based on a design in part that myself and Alex Reichschneider came up with many, many, many years ago. And BioQuip has instituted a number of improvements on the design. On the left is Ron McPeak. Ron is a good friend, a retired marine biologist, and he took me on a whirlwind tour of Oregon and southern Washington in 2016. And here he is inspecting a slash pile. A slash pile is where logging activities are going on. So there are freshly cut logs lying around. There are freshly cut branches that are draped over the stumps and the cut logs. And this is beetle heaven. On a good day, these materials can be crawling with all kinds of wood-boring species. Many of the photographs that were taken in the book were of specimens that were collected at this spot. And on the right is Ted McRae. Ted McRae is a well-known coleopterist from St. Louis, Missouri. He met me for a week in southeastern Arizona, and we traveled together, and he's demonstrating how to use a beading sheet. And just like the beading tray before, the beading sheet is held underneath a branch, and then you can use a dowel or a net handle to give the branches a good sharp whack, and the beetles and other insects will fall. They can be picked up with an aspirator, forceps. This is a technique that's typically used first thing in the morning or at night. During the day, during the heat of the day, many beetles will hit the sheet and fly away before you have a chance to even see what they were. Some other methods that I've used while I was working on this book, in the upper left-hand corner, this is a V-fit trap, a V-shaped flight intercept trap. So a conduit frame is set up, and then plastic sheeting is stretched across the frame and weighed down at the bottom over a series of pans that have collecting fluid. And when beetles and other insects come flying along, they hit the panels, and beetles typically, when they hit an obstruction, instead of going up, they'll go down, and they'll sort of bounce along this plastic film until they wind up in the fluid. And then you can collect them up to a few weeks later. They'll be preserved in this fluid. Many unusual species, many rare species, or species that have yet to be recorded in the United States were collected by this method using these traps in southern Arizona. This trap here, for lack of a more delicate term, this is poop on a stick. You can take your favorite feces, shmoo it on the end of a stick, drive it into the ground, put a pitfall trap with some propylene glycol or some other preservative, and the dung beetles will come flying in. And this is a great method, especially in wetter parts of the United States. It works very well in eastern United States, but in the West, it can be kind of tricky because the humidity is so much lower. The effectiveness of the dung doesn't last very long because things dry out very quickly. But in southeastern Arizona, during the monsoon season in the summertime, it can be a very effective trap, and especially if you're checking it every day or every few days. When I was a student in South Africa, one of the traps I started fooling around with was a 2-liter soda bottle. And you would just take an empty soda bottle, cut off the neck, and then cut off the bottle at the shoulders and take that middle piece and invert it and use it like a funnel. And before you put it into place, you take some rotting fruit, chopped up plantains, bananas, pineapple. You can take beer and wine, brown sugar, yeast, whatever your favorite recipe is. and then loop it together with a wire and hang it up into a tree. And this trap is incredibly effective for collecting several families of insects that are lured into sweet, sticky substances. Again, in the West, it can be kind of a little tricky because it dries out so quickly, and you'll get a dry skin or a film that forms on top within a day or two. So you have to check these traps frequently in order to keep up their effectiveness. Just before I went on my trip out west in 2008, I ran across these corncob feeders at Lowe's. It's just a coiled heavy-duty spring. You put in dried corn cobs and then hang it up in a tree, and the birds will go after it. And I thought, why not use them as a beetle trap? So I took a handful of them with me to Arizona. I was putting in plantains, bananas, sliced oranges, and they're a great trap for green fig beetles, I'll say that. But every once in a while, you get some other cool things. Here's a really nice euphoria specimen here, and there are other beetles that are tucked away in here. But I found this technique was worthwhile. But again, you've got to be careful because the fruit bait dries out very quickly. Now, I mentioned that there's a key to the families of beetles found in Western North America. It's a fool's errand to try and create a key that will allow you to accurately place every species you find in its proper family, at least in a book of this nature that is aimed at sort of a popular audience. I am involved in another project, the Beetles of Canada and the United States, that will include dichotomous keys to all the families and genera found in the United States, but that's not this book. So what I did here is I put together a key that includes 91 of the 131 families that are known west of the Continental Divide, and tried to use very simple characters that would allow the reader to take a beetle that they have in hand and narrow it down to just 1, 2, or 3 families. And then, of course, these families are cross-referenced. So in boldface, these are the families that are most likely to find in the field. And you can go to these pages in the book and see if your specimen matches something in the book. And if that doesn't work, then I have C also. And these are families that also have these characters. They're less likely to be found, but they are a possibility, and they're cross-referenced as well. The heart of the book are the family descriptions and the species diagnoses. Each family has a bit about their natural history, a diagnosis that distinguishes them from other beetles in Western North America. There's also a section on similar families, and sometimes the families are so unique, all you need, or distinctive, I should say, that all you need is a line or two to describe what separates them from other families. In larger families, there are bullet points that list a number of families that are superficially similar. Just because something's superficially similar doesn't mean it's necessarily related to one another, but I included as many examples as I was familiar with to give people an idea where else they could be looking if they're not quite satisfied with the examples that are found in the family. And then you have the fauna of the entire North America, United States and Canada. So for this family, the Epimetopodidae, there are a total of 4 species and 1 genus found in the United States and Canada. Then you've got a diagnosis here, a little bit about where they're found, and also you'll see a number in parentheses. That means that's the total number of species in that genus west of the Continental Divide. So if you see a low number, you can be somewhat confident that between the photograph and the diagnosis, you can accurately identify your specimen. If you see a high number, I would caution you to not assume that your beetle is the same one that's in the photograph, because there could be many, many lookalikes. Another feature of the book is that for all the scientific names, I also include the authority's name. That's the person who first described the beetle. Many field guides don't do this, but in my point of view, the authority is an essential part of the scientific name. And as you're going through the scientific names in the book, you'll see a lot of names over and over again, like Leconte and Horn and Casey. And I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the historical figures coleopterists who really paved the way for the modern research that we're doing today. And if there was a Mount Rushmore-like monument to the coleopterists of the past, let's say a Mount Whitney-esque monument, it might include these 5 gentlemen. And topping this list is John Leconte. He was one of the most eminent entomologists of the 19th century. He collected extensively in around San Francisco and San Diego. He described some 5,000 new species of beetles, many of which occur in Western North America, and he was a pioneer in the classification of North American beetles. Up to his time, North American workers were doing their best to pigeonhole North American beetles into a European classification. But Leconte paved the way to developing a classification that was more appropriate for the North American fauna. One of Leconte's contemporaries is George Horne. Horne arrived in California during the Civil War. He collected beetles throughout the state, ranch in Stanley County, as well as parts of Arizona, Nevada. He described 154 new genera and more than 1,600 new species. He didn't like just describing a single species here and there. He preferred to do monographs. And so he would describe new species within the context of the entire genus. So all the species known to him at the time could be identified. And upon Leconte's death in 1883, Horne became the preeminent coleopterist in North America. Thomas Casey collected beetles extensively in California from 1885 to 1886. And over his 40-year career, he described nearly 10,000 new species, publishing almost 9,000 pages on their taxonomy and biology. Now, much of Casey's work has been criticized over the years because he had a very different concept of what a species was. The slightest difference between individual species or specimens within a species were considered by him to be new species, individual species, and oftentimes they were just individual variation within the same species. However, in some of the families of beetles where the individuals were very small and poorly known, some of his work is held up all this time. Henry Fall made significant contributions to the study of beetles in North America, especially in the West. And it's interesting to note that his first paper, which was published in 1893, was inspired by a visit from George Horne. Horne made his last trip out to California in 1893 and traveled from Southern California to San Francisco and saw the work that Fall had been doing on his collecting forays in the San Bernardino Mountains and encouraged the young Fall to publish this paper. Fall assembled one of the finest private beetle collections of the day, which contained over 200,000 specimens, representing nearly 20,000 species. This is a phenomenal collection. His collection now resides with those of Leconte and Horne at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. And you can go to the Museum of Comparative Zoology's website and see the type specimens, that is the original specimens that Leconte, Horne, Fall, and many others used in their descriptions of new species of beetles. I've had a personal interest in Fall because he was a high school science teacher in Pasadena, at Pasadena High School, which is now Pasadena City College. But he was there as the science department chair at the same time my grandfather was. And so one of these days, I'm hoping to see if I can ferret out one way or another whether or not my grandfather possibly had Mr. Fall as one of his instructors. Edwin Vandijk was an outstanding authority on beetles of the Pacific states. He was also an expert on forest pest and the distribution of insects, especially of beetles in Western North America. And he wrote several very interesting papers in the 1920s and 1930s on the distribution of beetles in North America in relation to Europe and Asia. He was an inspirational teacher as well as an enthusiastic and conscientious collector. He always encouraged his students and collectors to, pardon me, leave things as they found them, return stones back, replace bark if possible, with the idea that you could go back and those sites would still be profitable for collecting beetles later. His collection of 200,000 beetles was presented to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco in 1924. And this donation was not insignificant because most of the collection, insect collection at the California Academy of Sciences was destroyed by the fire that followed the 1906 earthquake. I'd like to take a little bit of time and talk about how I came to writing this book and point out some of the people who were very important to me. When you read the dedication to the book, you'll see that a number of people were instrumental in encouraging my interest in natural history and entomology. And it all starts with my parents, Ed and Lois Evans. I grew up on the southwestern fringes of the Mojave Desert in the Antelope Valley. And there were great insects right outside my door. And they spent a lot of time taking my sister and I out on weekend excursions throughout the Mojave Desert, enjoying nature and historical sites. My mother loved the beach. And so we'd spend 1 week camping in Morro Bay or Pismo Beach. My dad loved the Sierra Nevada. So we spent a lot of time camping in different places in the Sierra Nevada. In fact, this is a photograph that my dad took of me when I was 13 years old. And this is me with my very first insect net. That's a mop handle, a coat hanger, and a cheesecloth net bag that my mom made for me. And this is a photograph of me taking the Sierra Nevada. I think it's around June Lake, but don't quote me on that. I've always been interested in insects since day one, but I first began getting interested in actually collecting insects in 1970. And my interest in collecting in part was fueled by my joining 4-H. Some of you might be familiar with 4-H. Many people think it's more of an agricultural organization, and that's not untrue, although there are urban chapters of 4-H. All of my friends had animals. They had horses and goats and chickens and guide dogs and cattle and swine. I didn't have any of those things. I was interested in insects. And so I joined the entomology project, and we would have demonstration days. And on those days, everybody would be outside with their animals, and that's where everybody was. I would be sitting alone at a card table with my insect collection, which then consists of 5 cigar boxes and my Golden Guides field guides. So I would be ready to identify and answer anybody's questions. And this gentleman on the left walked in and introduced himself as Chris Henney. And although I didn't appreciate it at the time, he was a very well-known lepidopterist. That's somebody who specializes in butterflies and moths. He was a preparator at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles in the 1940s. And he was well known for hand rearing all of his own specimens. He captured primarily moths, induced them to lay eggs, and then would raise them. He had a special room for raising caterpillars with freshly cut host plants. And he had a meticulously prepared that was postage stamp perfect. There was not one scale, not one notch was out of the wing. And even though I was sort of heavily leaning toward beetles at this time, I very much appreciated the care he took in maintaining his moth collection, and that always stuck with me. Chris set up my very first behind the scenes tour in the entomology department at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. And it was there on that very first trip, I met the curators, Roy Snelling, who was a hymenopterist specializing in ants, bees, and wasps, Julian Donahue, another lepidopterist, and Charlie Hogue, a dipterist who was a very important mentor to me. In addition to being a world-class entomologist, Charlie was also very much interested in informal science education, and he regularly gave lectures. He wrote popular books, and he was very much engaged in insect photography, and all these aspects of his work really inspired me and got me interested in these aspects of entomology. When I entered Palmdale High School, I was lucky enough to have 2 really good biology teachers that encouraged my interest in science and natural history and entomology in particular. In one of the most important aspects of my high school career was a field biology class that I took one summer, and they taught as a team. This is the best course I've ever taken in my entire academic career. And go out on 2 day trips every week and 1 overnight field trip. We went all over Southern California. We had to make an insect collection, a shell collection. We had to prepare study skins. We did vegetation mapping. We did all these amazing things. We visited museums in Los Angeles and San Diego. It was just an amazing time. And I'm very fortunate to be in touch with Bob Brister to this day. And it was a pleasure to give him a copy of this book to let him know that it was partly dedicated to him in recognition of all that he did for me. During that first trip to the Natural History Museum, in addition to meeting the curators, I met this gentleman, Bob Duff. And Bob was a coleopterist and a naturalist who spent a lot of time collecting in Southern California and Arizona. And he invited me on a trip to southeastern Arizona in 1972. And this was a big deal. I'd always collected insects with my parents on camping trips, but I had never been on a trip just totally focused on insects. And so this was a tremendous opportunity. And we went on several trips throughout the years in Southern California, all over Arizona, southern New Mexico. And one year we drove out as far as Western Texas. And Bob was the one that introduced me to the biodiversity of beetles in Western North America. And he also fueled my interest in scarab beetles. That's the particular group of beetles that I study. He's also the one that suggested studying under Elbert Sleeper at Cal State Long Beach and earning my bachelor's degree in entomology there, which I did. Elbert Sleeper was a well-known weevil authority. And just after I enrolled at Cal State Long Beach, I went on a trip to southeastern Arizona. It was late or mid-August. School was just going to start in a few weeks. And I was in Madera Canyon and just happened to run into this gentleman on my left here, Chuck Bellamy. And this was the beginning of a friendship that lasted over 35 years. Chuck was a world authority on buprestid beetles or jewel beetles. He was my lab mate at Cal State Long Beach, and he was given an opportunity to work on his doctorate at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And from the moment of his arrival, he began lobbying to get me there too. And a year later, I arrived in South Africa. And within a few weeks, we were on our first extended field trip to Malawi. And this was my first venture into the tropics. Most of my colleagues went to Mexico, Costa Rica, or Panama. I wound up in the old world tropics. I went to Central Africa and just had a marvelous time, although you wouldn't know it by this photograph here. This was our first night in the bush. You can see there's a lot of long faces there. There was something out there with us walking around our camp. We never figured out what it was, but kept us awake, and it was just stupid hot. I mean, the humidity was just stifling. It was a very uncomfortable night. That was my introduction to the tropics. To my left is Bern. He was a graduate student at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And here we are digging up carrion beetles up from underneath I believe it was a dead wildebeest. You might recognize Marcus's name from his recent book, Dance of the Dung Beetles, which just came out. And Marcus and his team won an Ig Nobel Prize just a few years ago. And if that's not enough for you, he gave this wonderful TED Talk on the behavior of dung beetles and the different experiments they designed to discover that dung beetles use the sun and the stars to navigate. And so if you get a chance, just go to TED Talks and look up dung beetles, and it'll be the best 17 minutes you've ever spent. While I was in South Africa, I was focused primarily on scarab beetles, but my research involved melanothine scarabs. These are the plain brown or black June bugs that often fly to your porch lights at night or gum up your pool filters and so on. They have monotonous morphologies for the most part. The best way to identify them is to dissect the male genitalia. So I did a lot of dissections while I was there, and still do. When I returned from South Africa with my degree in entomology, I've always had a strong interest in informal science education. And the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, where I'd been working as a student worker, had just received a $2 million grant to start an insect zoo. And insect zoos seem to be very popular now. Everybody has an insect zoo. But back in the late 80s, there were only 3 insect zoos in the United States, one at the Smithsonian, the Cincinnati, and San Francisco zoos. So I had the opportunity to start the 4th insect zoo in the United States, and that's what I did. I woke up in the middle of the night and thought, I want to do this. And during my 10-year stint there, I helped to create a cradle to grave bug program. We had a traveling insect zoo that went out to schools, summer camps, shopping centers, libraries. I had a teachers program where we encouraged teachers to include insects in their curricula. And it was during my time at the insect zoo that I was invited to write a popular book on beetles. And I jumped at the opportunity immediately. And then I went into a panic. It sort of struck me that this is the kind of book that somebody would write in the middle or the end of their career, not at the very beginning of their career. And so in my panic, I thought, misery loves company. Who could I get to work on this with me? And sure enough, Chuck Bellamy was willing to co-author this book with me. And as luck would have it, I had just come back from South Africa, and he was returning to South Africa to work at the Transvaal Museum. Fortunately for us, there was a newfangled means of communication called electronic mail in the early 90s. That enabled us to send back and forth. This was the hardcover edition, which came out in 1996. And a few years later, the University of California Press published the softcover version of An Inordinate Fondness for Beetles. Also during this time, I was invited to write the section on melanthine scarabs for American beetles. And this is the identification guide for North America, identifying beetles to family and genus. This is the book that we're doing a complete reboot on and have retitled Beetles of Canada and the United States, and it will be out hopefully in about another 5 years. Also during this time, I was invited to write a chapter on beetles for A Natural History of the Sonoran Desert. This was a joint publication by the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum and the University of California. When I attended the book launch at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, I was approached by the editor at the University of California, and she said, well, what's your next book? And so fortunately, I had an answer. I said, I've always wanted to write a handbook to the beetles of California. And that became these 2 books, An Introduction to California Beetles and A Field Guide to the Beetles of California, which I wrote with my good friend Jim Hogue, who's the son of Charlie Hogue, the dipterist at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. And Jim is a superb photographer and an excellent illustrator, as well as a really good writer. And so it was a real pleasure to work with him on these books. Since 2000, moving to Richmond, Virginia, I've been doing a lot of different things, teaching. You heard that I did a little bit of radio broadcasting. Just earlier this year, we took 6 episodes of What's Bugging You. These are 3-minute segments, and turned them into animations. And if you want to check those out, you can go to VPM, Victor, Peter, Mary, and go to What's Bugging You, and it'll take you right to the site, and you can check out these animated videos that we put together. They're a lot of fun. On the upper left, you can see me smiling with Andrew Smith. Andrew is on the staff of the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and we've been chipping away at the melalonthine fauna of the New World. And our most recent paper was published last year on the tribal classification of the Nearctic melalonthini. And one of the things that we did is we described for the first time the female of this beetle known as Acoma. There are over 25 species of Acoma that live throughout the Southwest. They live in very dry, sandy areas. And it's only the males that fly at night and come to lights. The females are completely unknown, except for this one specimen that was collected many, many years ago, but it's never been adequately photographed and described until this paper. Also, while here in Virginia, as part of my education on Eastern beetles, I had the opportunity to write the companion guide to Beetles of Western North America, and that is the Beetles of Eastern North America. And this book covers over 1,400 species, and it's a very similar format to the Western book. And it was just as I was finishing up this book, I mean, literally, I was working in real time with the people working on the layout for the book. They're based in England. It was 4:30 in the morning here. It was 9 o'clock or 9:30 in the morning in London. And I was working on the index, that last little bit of the book, and I just sent it off. And I was exhausted. I'd been up all night, and I went to bed, slept for a few hours, woke up, and my first thought was, I'm going to piece together the proposal for a Western book and see if they're interested. And within 2 weeks, I had provisional approval to work on the Beetles of Western North America. Starting in 2010, I undertook 6 trips to Western North America from Richmond, Virginia, and drove more than 8,000 miles to collect and photograph as many beetles as possible. And you can see that I spent a lot of time working in Arizona, but also managed to cover a lot of ground in California, parts of Nevada, and Western Oregon as well. As I mentioned, half the photographs were taken by me. I don't consider myself to be a macro photographer. I'm an entomologist that has gotten fairly adept at taking a certain kind of picture fairly well. There are some really great photographers out there that really know how to use a camera. I'm still trying to figure out mine sometimes. But for those of you that are interested in macro photography, here's the equipment that I'm using currently. I've got a Canon EOS 7D 100 millimeter macro lens. This is an old lens, not the new lenses that have the stabilization. This one has all my shakes and wiggles. And I use a macro twin light for lighting. I've never been a big fan of ring lights. They're certainly easy to use, but the lighting just doesn't look right to me. And I like the adjustable nature of these strobes. You can move them up and down, you can angle them differently. But as anybody knows that uses these kinds of lights, the flashes can still be pretty hot. And so I experimented with a lot of different diffusers until I found this set of diffusers that are produced by Ian McConaughey. And there's his URL there if you want to check them out. He doesn't always have them in stock, and I didn't check before this talk to see if he's offering them now. But these diffusers have worked really well for me, and I picked them up thanks to a couple of my photographers, Joyce Gross and Alice Abela, were using this rig, and I was really intrigued with them, and I loved their photography, and so I've used this setup to great effect. Since I spent a lot of time in Arizona, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Arizona. If you're not an entomologist or a naturalist that travels to Arizona, you may think of it as just being dry, barren desert. And there's certainly parts of Arizona are that way. But in southeastern Arizona, it's very different. You have these Madrian sky islands that are blanketed with pine oak woodlands at their higher elevations. And they're surrounded by deserts and grasslands. And some of these mountain ranges in southeastern Arizona might sound familiar to you. The Babaquivris, the Chiricahuas, Huachucas, Santa Catalina, Santa Rita Mountains. These areas are amazing places for naturalists in general, and they're incredible places to be for entomologists, especially coleopterists, where you're looking for beetles that are found nowhere else in the United States. The term Sky Island was coined by Weldon Heald. He was an excellent nature writer, and he first used the term Sky Islands in an article of that title that appeared in Natural History magazine in 1951. And he wrote that some of Earth's most interesting islands are nowhere near oceans or lakes. They are strictly land islands, but with a climate, vegetation, and animal life different from their surroundings, as if they rose from some remote sea. Now, Heald and his wife lived on the Rainbow Ranch, which is in Cave Creek in the Chiricahua Mountains. And in 1967, he published a book called Sky Island, which is on the natural history and human history of the Chiricahuas. And in the early 70s, the book was republished under the name Chiricahua Mountains, and then it was reprinted and expanded in the early 90s by the University of Arizona Press, and it was called the Chiricahua Mountain Sky Island. Even though this book is long out of print, you can still find them online at used bookstores, and it's well worth checking out. But I bring it up now because there was a time when the Healds realized that it was time for them to move back to the city, where it was easier for them to get around and go about their business. And so they were looking for a buyer for the Rainbow Ranch. And one day a gentleman was walking up their driveway and he introduced himself as Montcasir. Montcasir was a well-known coleopterist and dipterist at that time who was working at the American Museum of Natural History. And the American Museum was looking for property to buy to create a research station somewhere in southwestern United States. And to make a long story short, the Healds Rainbow Ranch became the Southwest Research Station, which is known to many researchers and naturalists today. So why is Arizona so special, or southeastern Arizona in particular? And it's because of these different biotic influences. To the west, you've got the Sonoran Desert. To the north, you've got the Rocky Mountains. To the south, you've got the Neotropics and the Sierra Madre Occidental. And to the east, you've got the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert, all influencing this incredibly rich area that we know as southeastern Arizona. So you have all of these plant and animal influences that are found in this very concentrated area in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico and adjacent Sonora and Chihuahua. Now, I can't possibly cover Arizona beetles adequately in this book because I'm covering everything from Alaska down to Southern California and southeastern Arizona. So I'm working on another book with Margarita Brummerman on Arizona beetles. This is a project that Margarita has been working on for a long time, and she's been photographing every beetle she can get her hands on from Arizona. At the moment, this field guide covers more than 2,200 species and 83 families that occur in Arizona. And this is just one of the plates that's found in the book. Right now, there's 220 plates in the book, and it's still growing a little bit. We're still looking for a publisher, but the writing is well underway, and I hope to have this book completed, the text written in the next year or two. Now I'd like to just end the presentation with some of my favorite beetles and photographs that I took while I was preparing this book. One of the most interesting beetles to me are whirligigs. These are beetles that you find gyrating wildly on the surface of the water. Gyrinus is a relatively small genus of whirligig beetles, and you'll find masses of them on slow-moving streams and pools. But in Arizona, there's another genus, Dynastys, and this is the largest whirligig that we have in the United States, and they tend to be rather solitary. You find just one or two of them on these pools. Sometimes they're attracted to lights at night, and every time I see them in Arizona, it's like seeing an old friend. Their bodies are supremely adapted for living on the surface of the water. Their middle and hind legs are paddle-like. Their front legs are raptorial, which means they're adapted for grabbing insect prey that's become trapped on the surface of the water. And their abdomen has the ability to bend downwards at almost 90 degrees and acts like a rudder. And that's how they can spin around in these very tight circles. Stag beetles are of great interest to me just because I think they're interesting looking. They're so named because the males of some species have these antler-like mandibles that suggest the antlers of a stag. And I'm sharing these two beetles with you tonight because both of these specimens, beetles, were collected and photographed in Santa Barbara County. They were both collected on a trip with Matt Gimmel right near Cold Springs Tavern, just over the other side of San Marcos Pass. There's a beautiful Mesic Canyon there with oak and madrone and other and it's just a great place to find insects, particularly beetles that tend to like it a little wetter. And it was during my visit there that I collected both of these beetles and incorporated them into the book. Another California, or I should say West Coast specialty, are Pleiocoma, or the rain beetles. Now that the rains are coming, starting later this month and in November, rain beetles will be flying around the West Coast states. And there are some species that fly only during winter rains or late winter when the snow starts to melt. And it's this species here, Pleiocoma octopagina, so named because it's got these 8 plates in its antennae. I had some specimens of these beetles with me that I'd found in a swimming pool that I had pinned and labeled and took with me to the Natural History Museum in LA on my very first visit. I wanted to convince everybody there I was serious about entomology and wanted to be an entomologist. And Bob Duff, who I introduced you to, recognized these beetles right away. I didn't know what they were. And he told me they were rain beetles. And he also informed me that until my specimens, they were only known from the type locality. That is, they were only known from one place where the original specimens were described. Now that type locality was just a few miles away. But now we know that these beetles have several populations all along the San Andreas Fault, along the northern slopes of the San Gabriel Mountains. On the right is a rain beetle of another species. And you'll notice the females are much larger, more rotund, and they are flightless. The males will fly to lights at night during rains or melting snow, but the females are strictly land-bound. And they will come up to the surface, they're burrowers, they'll release a pheromone, and that's what attracts the males. That's why the males have these very elaborate antennae, so they can find those the pheromones of the females. Species in the genus Chrysina. These are what I consider to be crowd pleasers. Arizona has 3 different species of these beetles. There's a 4th one found in Western Texas. Most of the species are found in tropical Mexico, Central and Northern South America. But these beetles are just absolutely gorgeous, and they're found in the Sky Islands of Arizona. This particular one here, Chrysina gloriosa, is the most widespread of these 3 species, and the adults feed on juniper. And so they're found in juniper woodlands all over Arizona, and they go as far east as Western Texas. Horn scarabs are always fun to find in Arizona. And again, for me, it's like seeing an old friend. Dynastys grantai, the Western Hercules beetle. This is a species at night, but you'll also find them sapping and establishing mating sites on ash trees growing along river bottoms in the canyons. For those taxonomists that are out there, you'll notice that grantai is spelled with 2 I's. This is the correct spelling, and it's been misspelled for many years by people, including myself. But Brett Ratcliffe at the University of Nebraska published a beautiful work on this group of beetles from the United States and Canada, and reminded us all once again that the original spelling in the original paper describing these species is the spelling we should be using. Strategus aloeus, known as the ox beetle. The males have these beautiful horns. The females of both of these species are hornless. They are unarmed. This species is found across southern United States, and it gets as far west as southeastern Arizona, and its range extends all the way to South America. We have this species here in Virginia as well. Since my friendship with Chuck Bellamy, I've always had an interest in jewel beetles, or the buprestids. And one night when I was driving from California to Arizona, it was a very stormy night in the eastern Mojave Desert along the Colorado River, which is really kind of a cool opportunity, because when it is raining, or at least the humidity's high, this triggers the emergence of all kinds of beetles that you may not see otherwise in the desert. So I just stopped in a expansive creosote bush and set up my lights as it was getting dark, and the air was filled with these 1/2-inch long beetles. They were flying like trucks in low gear, just buzzing everywhere. They were feeding on the creosote. They were mating on the ground. This is a day-flying beetle, but there were so many of them, they were even stumbling into my lights. This yellow is the result of a waxy bloom, a waxy powder that's produced by their exoskeleton, and it helps seal them off and helps them to prevent them from becoming overheated and dehydrated out in the sun, and it rubs off very easily. So I was very pleased with myself that I got a photograph of one with the waxy bloom intact. And I even managed to bring some specimens home that for the most part, that waxy coating is still there. Click beetles I've always found to be fascinating. They're so named because when they land on their backs, they will snap their bodies with a click that releases energy that flips them into the air. Hopefully they'll land on their feet and they have a chance to escape. Arizona has some wonderful beetles in the genus coleopterist. This is my favorite here because of this brilliant brassy green color, although some are more blue. We have 3 species of eyed click beetles in the West, including one that's in California that's associated with pines, and it goes all the way up through the Pacific Northwest as well. Speaking of click beetles, this genus of click beetles always fascinated me because they have these pectinate antennae, or these feathery antennae, and the males of this genus, Euthysanius, are fully winged and fly to lights at night. And the females have reduced elytra and are flightless. And this is a beetle that, thanks to the generosity of Paul and Sandy Russell, they saved one of these beetles for me in their yard. And when I came by, I was able to grab this beetle and it was still kicking, and I got a nice photograph of it. But I couldn't find any decent images of the female. I've never collected these myself. You find them in the foothills of Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and surrounding areas. But just weeks before I turned in the manuscript, one of my friends who had already contributed images to the book found one and photographed it to me. And thanks to Jen Reed's expert work on photographs, we were able to combine our 2 images together so you can compare the male with the female. Netwing beetles are soft-bodied beetles that tend to be very brightly colored, bright contrasting colors. They're aposematically colored, indicating that they're chemically defended. They taste bad. There are all kinds of mimicry complexes, other insects that have these similar color patterns to make you think, or make a predator think, that potentially they too taste bad as well. I live with fireflies. I moved to a place in Richmond where every year our yard is filled with fireflies. I didn't discover pink glowworms in Southern California until well into my university years. And there were several places around where the pink glowworms were well known. And one place I went up to was in the Angeles forest, and I found a female here. And here are 3 males attempting to mate with her. Actually, there's 2 males attempting to mate with her. One has been successful, the other are jockeying for position. Here's the male. They look very much like fireflies anywhere, but they're relatively small, and they don't bioluminesce. They don't produce a light unless they're under stress. And when they're handled, or if they're captured in a spider web, or sadly, if they're attracted to the digital readout on a hot tub and they fall into the hot chlorinated water, that will trigger their bioluminescence. Speaking of bioluminescent insects, the very first bioluminescent insect I ever saw was a larva, or a larviform female, of the fangoted beetles. And these are common in the foothill areas of Southern California and beyond. I had collected these larvae for many years as a kid and had no idea what they were. I found one the night before I made that first trip to the Natural History Museum, and I put it in a container, woke up at 2 in the morning, and this is what I saw. I had never seen a bioluminescent organism in my life. I was so excited, I ran into my parents' room. My mother wasn't nearly as enthusiastic as I was at 2 in the morning. You can see the males are very different looking. They're capable of flight. The males have these very elaborate antennae. Presumably, they use pheromones to find the females, but they have these large eyes as well. So clearly they have the ability to see the very secretive females that are usually down in the leaf litter. The larvae are millipede predators. This is the larva of an eastern species in the genus Fangotes, but Fangotes does occur in the West. And they will track down millipedes and bite them, kill them, and feed on their internal organs and tissues. Just to wrap this up, we've got some desert darkling beetles. When I was a kid, I remember seeing these little fuzzy guys outside of Little Rock. They're only about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch in length, if that. And I used to fill up my Superman lunch pail with them and take them home and set them up in a terrarium. Blister beetles have always fascinated me. They're soft-bodied beetles that are so named because they exude chemicals from their leg joints that cause blistering. And their larvae are ectoparasitoids of either grasshopper egg pods or subterranean bee larvae, depending on the species of blister beetle that we're talking about. Also in Arizona, I just love these blue fungus beetles. I never get enough blue in insects, at least not in this part of the world. And if you're in the right place at the right time, you'll see logs and stumps that are covered with the larvae. And you'll find places where they're pupating. The larvae will attach themselves to the bark and hang upside down, and the pupa forms at the end of the old exoskeleton of the larva. And in spite of their name, Cyphrotylus californicus, they are not found in California. They are not found in Baja California. It's just one of those weird things. Longhorn beetles, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the California prionis. These are the big bruisers that are attracted to lights during the summertime, and they make a squeaking noise when they're disturbed. You can hear them walking around. This is a really neat longhorn beetle that's a predator that mimics the netwing beetles that I showed you earlier. And I've been looking at swarms of netwing beetles in Arizona's every year to find one of these lurking around in those swarms, and haven't yet, but I spotted this one in Arizona all by itself a few years. Cactus beetles in California and Arizona and beyond, we've got several species of monolema, have really heavy armored bodies that are adapted for walking over or between cactus spines and feeding on the succulent tissues below. And weevils, thanks to my association with Bob Anderson, he's given me a whole new appreciation of weevils, and there are many fascinating weevils in Western North America, including this species. This is our largest native species of weevil that's found on cactus. And I added this one just because it's covered with these beautiful golden green scales. This is found on mesquite in Arizona. And while I'm out and about photographing beetles, I see other insects too. So for those of you that would like to see something else besides beetles, here's a little bit of eye candy, most of them from Arizona, of things I photographed while I was out looking for beetles for Western North America. I'm also interested in cicadas, and this is one of the surprises. I found a very cooperative cicada sitting on a grass stem, and it wasn't until I saw the photograph that on the laptop that I realized she was laying eggs. Those are little divots where she was cutting into the grass stem and laying her eggs. And only twice I've had a camera in hand when I've seen a tarantula hawk dragging a tarantula across the road. And this is not the greatest photograph, but it's one I don't mind sharing. But like I say, this is just one of those great battles in nature that you hear so much about. And it's just wonderful to see it happening sometimes. I wanted to give a shout out to several people in Santa Barbara and beyond in greater Santa Barbara County that were helpful to me in putting this book together. The Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History was instrumental in helping me select beetle species that went into this book. I went through their collection from the very beginning to the very end, looking for species and then looking for photographs for many of those species to go into the book. And Lucy Gimmel took a number of photographs that are in the book. Matt helped me identify some really problematic species. And Matt helped organize a trip to, I'm going to butcher the name of it, but it's one of the UC research stations along the coast in Monterey County that's at the southern end of the redwoods. And we spent several days there collecting beetles and photographing beetles, and it was just fantastic. I also want to thank Paul and Sandy Russell. I've known the Russells for many years when they lived in Santa Monica and were involved in the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles there. They've been very helpful to me over the years, and Sandy was great. She knew I was coming out to Santa Barbara, and she collected a lot of beetles and left them out for me, and a number of those beetles found their way into the book. And also just a little further up the road, Alice Abela up in Santa Maria County. She is a superb naturalist and photographer, and I just love her photographs, and she was very generous in providing many of the wonderful images that appear in this book. And I also want to give a shout out to my wife who's sitting next to me now. If it wasn't for Paula's insatiable curiosity about nature and beetles in particular, I wouldn't have been able to write this book or any of the other books I've written during this century. She's been a huge help to me. Thank you, sweetie. Now, you are welcome to buy Beetles of Western North America anywhere. You can find it at your favorite bookseller. It is everywhere. But if you're interested in getting an autographed copy, here's what you do. You go to bioquip.com and immediately go to My Cart. And in My Cart, type in the catalog number 3811WS. That's 3811WS, capital letters. And follow the prompts to check out. Immediately, Beetles of Western North America will pop up in the item description. And just before you check out in the notes, indicate if you want your book inscribed or autographed. An autograph is just my signature. If you wanted inscribed, something personalized, I'd be happy to do that too. The books are here with me in Richmond, Virginia. So as soon as I receive a packing slip from BioQuip, I will sign your book, I will get it in the mail, and I will send it directly to you. And I'm sure they would be happy to sell you a copy that is unsullied by me. Well, thank you very much for putting up with me this long and allowing me to talk to you long distance. I just wanted to end with one of my favorite vistas in Arizona. This is a view looking west from the Patagonia Mountains at Babaquiviri Peak in the Babaquiviris. Nogales is to the left and Tucson is to the right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Art. That was excellent.
My pleasure.
We do have time. We're a little bit over time, but we do have time for, I get it. We do have time for a couple of questions. We have some really encouraging comments from Richard Clausen in the chat that says, basically like, it's really nice to hear about your background and what brought you into this interest, and we hope to be mentors like this for future students as well.
Good.
And then Nancy is asking about fireflies and lightning bugs. And she says, I know they don't live in the West, but what's happened to the fireflies, lightning bugs? They seem scarce.
Well, a couple things. Fireflies and lightning bugs are neither flies or bugs. They're soft-bodied beetles. And depending on where you are, we call them different things. I'm not correcting anybody. I'm a firefly guy myself. And the family Lampyridae does occur in the West. In California, we have those pink glowworms that I shared with you earlier, but the actual Lampyrids, fireflies that fly around and flash, as far as I know, they get about as far west as southeastern Arizona. Now, someone may take me to task on that further north, but that's as far as I know. It's very dry in the West. There are other species of Lampyrids that do not bioluminesce once they reach maturity, although the eggs, larvae, and pupae of all known species are bioluminescent. The adults of many species lose that ability after they emerge from the pupa. What's going on with fireflies? You hear a lot of them about disappearing, especially in the East. I think it's in part because of light pollution. Fireflies are having difficulty finding each other, even if they're around. People leaving security lights on all night long. You've got LED lights, which are in part inspired by, the technology was inspired by fireflies, and yet it's leading to their demise in some areas, which is sad. And also the habitat is disappearing. You've got to leave stuff on the ground. There's got to be leaf litter. There's got to be duff on the ground where their prey lives. They feed on larvae, they feed on earthworms, they feed on slugs and snails, things like that. If there's no place for them to live, no place for their prey to live, they can't survive. Fireflies are doing really well in my neighborhood on Northside Richmond. I've been to a number of places out in the woods in Virginia, and they're gangbusters. But in newer neighborhoods, no, they're not that common.
Wow. Well, I guess that kind of plays into the next question that we got really well, is that do you have any estimate of the decline of insect populations due to climate change and habitat loss?
I don't. That's another talk that I do on the insect apocalypse. We can talk about that now. The short version is this, is there have been some alarm bells that have been sounded based on different studies around the world looking at samplings of different groups of insects. The catch is this, is that we haven't been looking at many groups of insects long enough to know what their populations were in the beginning. We have, many of us old guys around here have this sense that there are fewer insects around. We don't see them on our windshields. We call that the windshield phenomenon. But now you don't see that anymore, or you rarely see it. So there's something going on, and we really need to study insect populations more carefully than we have been. And most of the studies are taking place in Europe. There are more studies that are appearing in North America, but there's a real bias toward temperate areas. But we're starting to see studies in tropical areas that are showing declines for some insect groups. And this is concerning, considering that these areas are away from direct human influence. Something is going on, but we're not sure. The greatest drivers are habitat loss and introduced species, exotic species that are out-competing or destroying food and habitat. Those are the two greatest drivers, but artificial lights, pesticide use, exotic plants, that kind of thing, all those contribute to extirpation and extinction of insects.
Thank you. We'll bring it back local with one last question to wrap things up.
Sure.
Robert wants to know, is there a good place to see glowworms anywhere near Santa Barbara?
I would defer to Matt Gimmel on that. He would know better than I, but I'm based on my experience further south, I imagine that in the bottomlands of some of the canyons up in the foothills where it's relatively lush, that's where you're likely to see them. But I'll bet Matt would be able to come up with a more precise locality. That might be a fun museum field trip sometime to look for pink glowworms.
I think that would be a very fun field trip for sure.
Sorry, Matt.
Well, thank you so much, Art, and all of you, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.